The galaxy had seen war. It had seen plague, famine, the slow grind of imperial occupation crushing systems into submission one by one, the cold mathematics of a moth deciding how many lives constituted an acceptable loss. It had seen the Jedi fall, seen the Senate dissolved, seen hope reduced to whispers passed between desperate people in the back rooms of cantinas on worlds that didn't even appear on Imperial navigation charts. The galaxy far, far away had endured horrors that stretched across centuries, and it had survived them all, because the horrors it faced, however terrible, however vast, were horrors that belonged to it. They were native. Comprehensible, at least in theory. Things that could be mapped, studied, fought, and sometimes defeated. What came to Mimban on that particular evening was none of those things. It arrived without warning, which was itself unusual. The Imperial garrison stationed on Mimban's equatorial marshlands had been in place for 3 years, monitoring the planet's sparse population of Mimbanese workers and the handful of energy mining operations the Empire had established along the northern ridge. They had sensors. They had patrols. They had a full intelligence apparatus designed to detect unauthorized landings, rebel supply drops, and any other irregularity that might disturb the Empire's grip on this miserable, rain-soaked rock. The sensors detected nothing. The patrols reported nothing. There was no hyperspace emergence, no atmospheric entry signature, no thermal bloom from a descending vessel's heat shields. There was simply a moment when the swamp was empty, and then a moment when it was not. The structure appeared 3 kilometers southeast of the garrison perimeter, rising from the Mimban marshland like something that had always been there and had only now chosen to be seen. It was enormous, a plantation house in the style of Earth's American Deep South, white-columned and sprawling, its facade cracked and blackened with mold that moved in ways mold should not move, its windows dark except for a faint luminescence that pulsed at irregular intervals from somewhere deep within. The ground around it had changed. Where Mimban's native gray-green marsh grass had grown, there was now Louisiana mud, thick and red-brown and utterly alien to this world's ecosystem. Spanish moss hung from trees that had not existed 60 seconds ago. The air around the structure smelled of rot and sweetgrass and something underneath both of those things, something chemical and alive and deeply, fundamentally wrong. The displacement event registered on the garrison's seismic sensors as a minor tremor. The duty officer noted it, flagged it for morning review, and returned to his card game. He would be dead before morning. Inside what had once been the Baker family plantation, in what had once been the state of Louisiana on a planet called Earth in a dimension that no longer had any relevance to the 2 men currently crouched behind an overturned refrigerator in the ruined kitchen, Michael Baldwin was trying to remember how to breathe. He was 29 years old and he looked 50. His eyes had the quality that only comes from years of genuine, sustained, unrelenting terror. Not the sharp fear of a single traumatic event, but the chronic exhaustion of a man who had been hunted for so long that vigilance had become his only resting state. He held a sawed-off shotgun in both hands, its barrel pointed at the kitchen doorway, and he did not blink. He had learned, over the years, that blinking created windows. Windows were how the tall man got in. Beside him, Reggie Bannister was reloading his 4-barrel shotgun with the practiced efficiency of a man who had performed this action several thousand times under conditions significantly worse than these. Reggie was older than Mike by more than a decade, broader through the shoulders, with a ponytail that had survived things that had not survived, and the particular brand of calm that emerges in human beings who have passed through so many impossible situations that impossible has simply lost its power to impress. He was bleeding from a cut above his left eye. He didn't mention it. There were more pressing concerns. It moved, Mike said, very quietly. I know, Reggie said, equally quiet. The whole house moved, Reg. Not like the rooms shifting, I mean the whole structure. I felt it, like when you're in a car and someone hits a pothole. I felt it too. That means he moved it. That means he brought us somewhere. Reggie snapped the 4-barrel closed and looked at his friend. In the dim luminescence filtering through the kitchen's broken windows, his expression was difficult to read, but Mike had known Reggie long enough to parse the subtleties. There was fear there, yes. There was always fear. But there was also something else, something that had calcified over years of survival into a kind of defiant, almost furious practicality. Then we figure out where somewhere is, Reggie said, and we work with that. If you want to see more crossover horror stories collide with the Star Wars galaxy, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character or universe you'd want to see in the comments below. May the Force be with you. The sound that had been building beneath the floorboard since the displacement, a wet, rhythmic thumping that Mike had initially attributed to the house's plumbing before remembering that the Baker plantation had not had functional plumbing for years, crescendoed suddenly into something that shook the walls. A sentinel sphere punched through the kitchen ceiling with a sound like a gunshot, trailing a ribbon of dark matter filament, and Reggie was already moving, dropping flat, letting it pass over him by 4 inches before he rolled left and came up firing. 2 of his 4 barrels discharged into the sphere's casing. The first shot deflected off its polished surface at an angle that took a chunk out of the upper cabinet. The second found the seam where the sphere's anterior drilling mechanism retracted between active states, and the sphere detonated with a shriek of ruptured metal and the smell of ozone. Reggie was back behind the refrigerator before the debris finished falling. "Still works," he said, checking his remaining loads. "We need to get outside," Mike said. "If he moved the house, the dimensional anchor is somewhere in the building. If we're outside when he seals it, we might have a chance." What he didn't say, because he didn't need to, because Reggie already knew, was that outside might be worse. Outside might be wherever the tall man had chosen to bring them, and the tall man did not choose locations randomly. He chose them with purpose. He chose them because they served his design. Whatever was outside the Baker plantation's cracked and mold-eaten walls was outside because the tall man wanted them to encounter it. They went anyway. There was no other choice. There was never any other choice. The back door of the plantation opened onto a screened porch that sagged under the weight of years and neglect, and beyond the porch, lit by the dim phosphorescence of a sky that was absolutely, unambiguously not Earth's sky. 3 moons hung in a configuration that Mike's memory could not reconcile with any astronomical chart he had ever seen, and the stars beyond them were wrong, distributed in patterns that spoke of a different galactic neighborhood entirely. Beyond the porch was a swamp. But it was a swamp that bled at its edges into something else, into gray-green marshland that stretched toward a horizon where structures glittered with electric light, and above those structures, barely visible through the cloud cover, the angular silhouette of something enormous moved in slow patrol. Mike stared at it for a long time. "Reg," he said. "Yeah. That's not a plane." "No," Reggie agreed, watching the silhouette's running lights with an expression of concentrated attention. "That's not a plane." Behind them, inside the plantation, something laughed. It was a sound without humor, without warmth, without any quality that could be called human, a low, resonant sound that seemed to come from the walls themselves, from the mold that pulsed in the corners, from the dimensional architecture that the tall man had been building in this structure since before either of them had been born. It was the sound of a being who had moved his pieces into position and found the board to his satisfaction. The game, whatever it was, had entered a new phase. Mike chambered around. Reggie checked his loads one final time. The moons of Mimban looked down at them with complete indifference, and somewhere in the distance, across 3 kilometers of alien marshland, an Imperial garrison that had no context for what was coming continued its nightly routines, utterly unaware that the mathematics of its existence had just changed in ways that could not be undone. The swamp was quiet for exactly 4 more seconds. Then the screaming started. The screaming lasted 40 seconds. Mike counted. He had developed the habit years ago, in the early days when the tall man had first entered his life and transformed it into something unrecognizable, the habit of counting, of measuring, of imposing numerical structure on experiences that resisted every other form of human comprehension. Counting gave him something to hold on to. It gave the chaos a frame, even if the frame was arbitrary, even if the numbers meant nothing beyond the simple fact of their progression. 1, 2, 3, The screaming lasted 40 seconds and then stopped with the particular abruptness that meant whoever had been screaming was no longer capable of it. Reggie was already moving toward the sound before the silence fully settled. "Reg," Mike started. "Someone's out there. Someone's always out there. That's how he works, he puts people out there, he uses them to draw us. I know how he works." Reggie didn't stop moving. He crossed the sagging porch in 4 strides, descended the steps into the Louisiana mud that had replaced Mimban's native marsh grass, and oriented himself toward the direction the sound had come from with the practiced efficiency of a man who had long since made peace with the fact that doing the right thing and doing the safe thing were rarely the same action. "You coming?" Mike came. The terrain between the plantation and the source of the screaming was approximately 200 meters of transitional ground. A scene where the tall man's displaced Louisiana ecosystem met Mimban's native marshland, where red-brown mud gave way to gray-green silt and the Spanish moss hanging from transplanted cypress trees thinned and then disappeared entirely, replaced by the alien vegetation of a world that had never seen a cypress tree and would have had no framework for understanding one. The transition was abrupt enough to be nauseating, like crossing an invisible line where the rules of reality had been renegotiated without anyone's consent. Mike felt it as a pressure change, a subtle shift in the quality of the air, the way the light from the 3 moons fell at a slightly different angle on the far side of the seam. What they found at the source of the screaming was a man in white armor. He was alive, which was surprising. He was on his knees in the marsh grass, which was less surprising given what was hovering in front of him. The sentinel sphere that had been following him, tracking him, Mike recognized the behavior immediately. The slow circling pattern that preceded a strike had paused in its rotation, its drilling mechanism extended but not yet engaged. It was, Mike understood with a chill that had nothing to do with Mimban's ambient temperature, playing with him. The tall man's instruments did that sometimes. They had a quality that fell somewhere between animal and mechanical, and like certain animals, they occasionally indulged in something that looked uncomfortably like cruelty for its own sake. The armored man was breathing hard. His helmet was on, which meant Mike couldn't see his face, but the body language was unmistakable. The rigid stillness of someone who understood that movement would trigger an attack and was devoting every available unit of willpower to not moving. In one hand he held a weapon Mike didn't recognize, a rectangular device that looked like a firearm but wasn't configured like any firearm Mike had encountered. His other hand was pressed flat against the marsh grass, keeping him upright. Reggie raised his forebarrel. "Hey," he said to the sphere. Loudly. Without preamble. This was Reggie's primary tactical philosophy. When subtlety had failed, and it had always already failed, volume and directness were the only remaining options. The sphere rotated toward him. "Yeah," Reggie said. "That's right. Come on." It came. Reggie fired once, a calculated single barrel, catching the sphere in its equatorial band and sending it spinning off its axis. It recovered faster than he'd anticipated. They always recovered faster than you anticipated. That was one of the tall man's fundamental design principles, the thing that made his instruments so exhausting to fight, the way they adapted between encounters, and drove itself at Reggie's chest with its drilling mechanism screaming. Reggie dropped. The sphere passed over him. Mike fired his sawed-off into its rear aspect and the combination of both impacts was enough. The sphere came apart in a cascade of metal and dark matter and something that smelled like formaldehyde and burned copper. The armored man stared at them. After a long moment, he said something in a language neither of them understood. Mike and Reggie looked at each other. "He's not speaking English," Mike said. "I noticed that. Or any language I've ever heard. Also noticed that." The armored man said something else, shorter this time, with an inflection that even across the language barrier carried the unmistakable quality of a question. He had risen from his knees and was now standing, weapon pointed not at them but angled downward, not a surrender posture, Mike judged, but a cautious one. A professional's posture. Someone who had been trained to de-escalate without disarming, who was assessing the situation rather than reacting to it. Mike raised one hand, palm out. Universal enough, he hoped. The armored man was a stormtrooper, though neither Mike nor Reggie had any framework for that designation. What they saw was white armor that covered the man from head to toe, armor that had clearly been designed with serious defensive intent, armor that was nevertheless scuffed and mud-streaked and bearing impact marks that spoke of recent violence. He was roughly 6 feet tall. He was alone. He was, Mike estimated, about as frightened as it was possible to be while still maintaining a functional operational posture, which meant he was a professional dealing with something that had broken through his professional categories. They had that in common, at least. The communication problem resolved itself not through language but through circumstance. 2 more stormtroopers emerged from the marsh grass to the north at a run, and behind them, moving through the alien vegetation with a speed that made the marsh grass ripple in its wake, came something that all 3 of them, Mike, Reggie, and the armored man, recognized instinctively as a threat. It was a dwarf. Or it was shaped like a dwarf, dressed in the ragged remnants of a brown robe, its face hidden beneath a hood, its movements wrong in the specific way that the tall man's converted servants always moved wrong, too fast, too certain, with no wasted motion and no self-preservation instinct because self-preservation instinct required a self to preserve, and whatever had occupied this body before the conversion was gone now, replaced by something that served a different architecture entirely. The 2 new stormtroopers fired their weapons. The blaster bolts, neither Mike nor Reggie had a name for what those weapons fired, but they saw the results, struck the dwarf servant and knocked it backward without stopping it. It absorbed the impacts and kept coming. Aim for the head, Reggie said, to no one in particular and everyone at once. He demonstrated, firing his second barrel. The dwarf servant dropped and did not get up. The silence that followed was the specific silence of multiple parties rapidly revising their threat assessments. The 3 stormtroopers were looking at Reggie's 4-barrel shotgun with an attention that suggested they understood they were looking at a weapon, even if the weapon's operating principles were unfamiliar to them. Reggie was looking at their blasters with the same quality of attention. Mike was watching the tree line, where the darkness had thickened in a way that had nothing to do with the angle of Mimban's moons and everything to do with the fact that the tall man expressed himself through shadow before he expressed himself through anything else. "We need to move," Mike said. "All of us. Right now." He pointed away from the plantation, away from the darkness thickening in the tree line. And then pointed at the stormtroopers and made a gesture that he hoped communicated "come with us" without communicating anything else. The first stormtrooper, the one they'd found on his knees, looked at his 2 companions. Some communication passed between them that Mike couldn't interpret, conducted in gestures and the subtle body language of people who had worked together long enough to develop a nonverbal shorthand. Then the first stormtrooper pointed in the same direction Mike had pointed and said something short and decisive to his companions, and they moved. It was not trust. Mike understood that. It was the temporary alignment of people who shared an immediate threat and had not yet had the time or information to fully assess whether they were also threats to each other. It was the oldest and most fragile of alliances, built entirely on the foundation of something worse being directly behind all of them. From inside the plantation, 300 meters to their south, the tall man's laugh rolled out across the marsh like a fog bank, low and satisfied and patient in the way that only something genuinely immortal can afford to be patient. The darkness in the tree line moved. They ran. The Imperial garrison on Mimban's equatorial marshlands had been built with the Empire's characteristic philosophy of function over elegance, a cluster of prefabricated durasteel structures arranged in a defensive perimeter, surrounded by a modular energy fence that was currently doing nothing useful because the threat it had been designed to repel was not coming from outside the perimeter. It was coming from the marsh. It was coming from the darkness at the edge of the sensor range, moving in ways that the garrison's motion detectors registered as anomalous and then stopped registering entirely, as if whatever was out there had learned the sensor's parameters between passes and adjusted accordingly. Sergeant Davin Creech was the ranking officer on night watch, a position he had held for 14 months without incident and had come to regard as the military equivalent of a clerical assignment. Tedious, safe, and deeply beneath his ambitions. He was 34 years old, a career Imperial soldier from Korlag who had tested well on tactical assessments and performed adequately in the field and had nevertheless found himself assigned to Mimban's garrison through a bureaucratic process he had never fully understood and had long since stopped trying to. Mimban was where careers went to stagnate. It was where the Empire sent soldiers it didn't need elsewhere, which was its own particular variety of insult. He was reconsidering the value of tedium when the first patrol failed to check in. Standard protocol allowed a 15-minute window before a missed check-in triggered a search response. Creech initiated the search response at the 12-minute mark, because the motion detector anomalies had been escalating for the past hour and he had learned in 14 months of Mimban garrison duty that the marsh had moods, and tonight's mood was wrong. He dispatched a 4-man search team with orders to locate Patrol 7 and report back. The search team checked in at the 5-minute mark to report they had found Patrol 7's last known position. They did not report what they found there. The communication simply stopped, mid-transmission, with a sound in the background that Creech could not identify and did not want to think about too carefully. He had just begun drafting an emergency transmission to the MOF's regional command when the garrison's eastern gate opened and 6 figures stumbled through it. 3 of them were his stormtroopers, TK-4471, TK-4472, and TK-8834, the last of whom Creech had sent out with Patrol 7 and had written off as lost. They were alive but moving with the particular urgency of people who had recently been very close to not being alive, their armor mud-streaked and bearing impact damage that Creech's tactical eye catalogued automatically. Blunt force trauma consistent with projectile weapons, partial heat scoring on TK-4471's left pauldron that didn't match any weapon in the standard threat database, and on TK-8834's helmet a series of deep parallel scratches that looked almost biological in origin, like something with fingers had tried to get through the armor and nearly succeeded. The other 3 figures were the problem. They were human, which was the most charitable interpretation. They were bipedal, they were the right size, they had the right number of limbs arranged in the right configuration. But they were dressed in nothing that resembled any uniform, faction insignia, or cultural identifier that Creech could place in the Imperial threat taxonomy, and they were carrying weapons that his armory sergeant, standing beside him with an expression of professional bewilderment, could not immediately classify. The older one, broad-shouldered, bleeding from above one eye, carrying a multi-barreled projectile weapon that appeared to operate on chemical propellant principles that had been obsolete in the core worlds for 3 centuries, was looking around the garrison interior with the sharp, assessing gaze of a man cataloging exits. The younger one was watching the gate they had just come through with an expression that Creech recognized across every cultural and linguistic barrier that might otherwise separate them, because it was the expression of someone who understood that closing a door did not mean the thing outside the door was stopped. The 3rd figure was a young woman. Early 20s, dark-haired, dressed in clothing that was even more inexplicable than her companions, carrying what appeared to be a modified crossbow of all things, who was looking at the garrison's equipment with an expression that mixed terror with a determined, almost aggressive curiosity. TK-8834, Creech said. Report. The stormtrooper's helmet turned toward him. When he spoke, his voice carried the particular quality of someone choosing words with great care because the available words were insufficient for the available experience. Sergeant. We encountered a hostile entity approximately 400 meters southeast of the perimeter. Nature of entity unclear. Standard blaster fire was largely ineffective. The 2 civilian males neutralized the entity using their weapons. We assessed tactical cooperation as the optimal response and withdrew to the garrison. You brought civilians into an Imperial garrison. The alternative was remaining outside an Imperial garrison, Sergeant, with the entity still mobile. Creech looked at TK-8834 for a long moment. Then he looked at the 2 civilian males, who were looking back at him with expressions that suggested they were conducting their own assessment of whether he was a threat or a resource. Then he looked at the eastern gate, beyond which the marsh was now thoroughly, unnaturally silent in the way that certain predators created silence by their proximity. Get them inside the command structure, he said. Separate room. 2 guards. Nobody touches their weapons yet. The yet was a concession to tactical reality. Whatever was out there in the marsh, it had absorbed blaster fire and kept moving. The older civilian's weapon had stopped it. Confiscating the weapon and then discovering you needed it was a category of mistake that Creech had no interest in making. The command structure's briefing room was a spare Durasteel box with a table bolted to the floor and 4 chairs that had been designed for function rather than comfort, which meant they were uncomfortable in ways that seemed almost deliberate. Mike sat in one. Reggie sat in another. The young woman, whose name Mike had established through a combination of gestures and the universal language of shared survival, was something he couldn't pronounce but had mentally reduced to a 2-syllable approximation, sat in the third. She had arrived at the garrison's eastern gate from a different direction than Mike and Reggie, emerging from the marsh grass alone and at speed approximately 30 seconds after they had, and the stormtroopers had swept her inside with the same tactical pragmatism they'd applied to everything else in the past 20 minutes. She was not from Earth. Mike was increasingly certain of this. The crossbow she carried was loaded with bolts that glowed faintly along their shafts, and the way she moved suggested a physical capability that went slightly beyond what he would have expected from someone her size and apparent age. She also, he had noticed, seemed to understand approximately as much of what the Imperial soldiers were saying as he did, which was to say nothing, and yet she watched their mouths when they spoke with an intensity that suggested she was trying very hard to change that. Sergeant Creech entered the briefing room with a data pad and the expression of a man preparing to extract information from people who had no reason to give it to him and who he had no leverage over yet. He began speaking. Neither Mike nor Reggie understood a word. The silence that followed had a quality of mutual frustration that required no translation. Reggie leaned forward, put both hands flat on the table, and said, very slowly and clearly, "We need to go back out there." Creech looked at him. "There is something in that structure," Reggie continued, pointing in the general direction of the plantation, "that is going to start sending more of those things." He mimed the sphere with one hand, a circling gesture, then made an explosive gesture with his fingers. "More. Lots more. And then it is going to send worse things. And eventually it is going to come itself. And when it comes itself, these walls," he gestured at the Durasteel around them, "are not going to be enough." Creech watched the gesture, watched the man's face, watched the conviction in his eyes. He had interrogated enough people over his career to recognize the difference between performance and genuine urgency, and what he was looking at was genuine urgency operating at a level that suggested the man across the table had been living inside this particular crisis for long enough that the urgency had become structural, not a response to the current situation but a permanent condition, the baseline from which all other emotional states were measured. He tapped his data pad. Pulled up the motion sensor logs from the past 3 hours. Turned the data pad around so Mike and Reggie could see the screen. The anomalies on the sensor readout were spreading. What had begun as isolated irregularities in the southeastern quadrant had expanded steadily, methodically, in a pattern that was not random. It was a pattern that suggested something mapping territory. Something establishing the parameters of a new domain. Mike looked at the sensor readout for a long time. "He's not hiding," he said, quietly, to Reggie. "He's not trying to stay concealed. He wants them to see this. He wants them to understand that the space is changing. He's establishing dominance over the environment before he moves into it." "That's new," Reggie said. "No," Mike said. "It's not new. It's what he always does. We just usually don't have the sensors to watch it happen in real time." Outside, in the marsh, one of the garrison's perimeter lights flickered and went dark. Then another. Then a third, in a line, as if something was walking along the fence line and the lights were going out in its wake. Sergeant Creech was already reaching for his comm unit when the eastern gate sensor alarm began its long, flat, continuous tone that meant the sensor was no longer reading the gate as closed. The gate was closed. They had all watched it close. The sensor disagreed. The transmission that left Mimban's equatorial garrison at 0300 local time was flagged Priority 2 by the regional relay station, which meant it joined a queue of approximately 40 other Priority 2 transmissions generated by the Empire's various outer rim operations that night and would reach Moff Quarren's attention sometime in the next 6 to 18 hours depending on the volume of Priority 1 traffic. This was standard procedure. This was how the Empire processed information. Through a hierarchy of urgency that had been designed for a galaxy whose threats were comprehensible, whose enemies had fleets and supply lines and political objectives that could be mapped and countered. The hierarchy had no category for what was happening in Mimban's southeastern marsh. Priority 2 was the closest available approximation, and it was catastrophically insufficient. Sergeant Creech had composed the transmission with the care of a man aware that his career, his credibility, and possibly his continued assignment to a posting he had previously considered the worst available option were all dependent on how accurately and how credibly he could describe something that he did not have an accurate or credible description for. He had written 3 drafts. The first had been honest and had read like the testimony of a man experiencing a psychological break. The second had been clinical to the point of uselessness, stripping out every detail that might seem implausible and leaving behind a document so sparse it communicated almost nothing. The third, which he had ultimately transmitted, was a compromise that he was not satisfied with, a report of anomalous energy signatures, unknown civilian contacts, malfunctioning perimeter sensors, and the unexplained deaths of Patrol 7. The details of which he had described as consistent with aggressive local fauna because aggressive local fauna was a category that existed in the Imperial threat taxonomy and what had actually killed Patrol 7 did not. He had not mentioned the silver spheres. He had not mentioned the dwarves in the brown robes. He had not mentioned the structure that had appeared from nowhere in the southeastern marsh, or the fact that the structure appeared to be actively expanding its footprint, or the fact that 3 perimeter lights had gone dark in sequence and the eastern gate sensor was reading the gate as simultaneously closed and not closed, a quantum state of access that the garrison's engineering team had been unable to resolve because the sensor itself appeared to be functioning correctly and was simply reporting a reality that the physical evidence contradicted. He had not mentioned any of this because he was a practical man and practical men transmitted actionable intelligence, not fever dreams. What he had transmitted, between the lines of his careful clinical language, was a request for guidance. What he received, 6 hours later, was an acknowledgement of receipt and a notation that Regional Command was monitoring the situation. This was the Empire's way of saying that the situation had been heard and filed and would be addressed when something more important finished being addressed first. Creech read the response. Set his datapad down. Looked at the sensor readout, which had continued its methodical expansion through the night, the anomalies now covering an area approximately 4 times what they had covered when he'd first shown the display to the 2 strange civilians. Then he looked at the civilians themselves, who had spent the night in the briefing room under guard and had not slept and had spent the hours of darkness talking to each other in their incomprehensible language with the focused intensity of people working a problem. He made a decision that his career assessment profile would probably have predicted he was unlikely to make, because his career assessment profile had been constructed on the assumption that his decision-making would occur within a context that made sense. He walked into the briefing room, dismissed the 2 guards, pulled out the chair across from the older civilian, and sat down. The older man looked at him. The younger man, sitting against the far wall with his shotgun across his knees, watched without moving. Creech put his datapad on the table between them, sensor readout visible, and pointed at the expanding anomaly field. Then he pointed at the 2 civilians. Then he turned his palms up, a gesture he was not certain translated across whatever cultural gulf separated them, but which seemed like the most universally legible version of "I don't know what to do and I think you might." The older civilian looked at the sensor readout for a long moment. Then he looked at his companion. Then he turned back to Creech and began speaking, slowly, using words that Creech could not understand but that were accompanied by gestures precise enough to carry meaning across the language barrier. He pointed at the sensor readout and made a spreading gesture with both hands. It grows. He pointed southeast, toward where the plantation would be, and made a circular gesture that Creech interpreted, based on the context of what TK-8834 had reported, as a reference to the spherical entities. He held up one finger and pointed at himself. Then held up one finger and pointed at Creech. Then spread both hands wide and brought them together. We need to work together. Then he pointed at the sensor readout again, at the expanding anomaly field, and drew his finger slowly across his throat. Creech had understood enough. What he had not anticipated was the arrival, 4 hours later, of the shuttle. It came in from the north, a Lambda-class Imperial shuttle with command markings that Creech recognized as belonging to the Inquisitorius, which was a recognition that produced in him a complex reaction composed approximately equally of relief, professional anxiety, and the specific dread of a man who has requested help and received a form of help that he would not have chosen if he had understood what was being sent. Inquisitors were effective. They were also not easy to manage, not predictable in their methods, and not particularly interested in the concerns of garrison sergeants when they had decided on a course of action. The Inquisitor who descended the shuttle's ramp was young, which surprised him. She appeared to be in her mid-20s, with close-cropped hair and the gray uniform of her office worn with the ease of someone who had owned it long enough to stop thinking about it. She was not physically imposing in the way that some Inquisitors were. What she was, Creech understood within approximately 15 seconds of her stepping onto the garrison's landing pad, was alert in a way that was qualitatively different from ordinary alertness, a constant, fine-grained attention to everything in her environment simultaneously, like a sensor array that never powered down. She looked at the garrison. She looked at the marsh. She looked at the southeastern horizon, where the plantation's upper stories were dimly visible in the morning light. And then she looked at Creech with eyes that were dark and precise and carrying something behind them that he could not name but that made him want to take a step backward. "Your transmission was inadequate," she said. Her basic was perfect. "I'm going to need a complete accounting of everything that occurred, not the version you decided Regional Command could handle." "Yes, Inquisitor," Creech said. Her name, he would learn, was Isara. She had no number designation, which was unusual. Most Inquisitors used numbered titles as their primary identifier, a practice that enforced the Order's philosophy of individuality suppression in service of the dark side's purposes. The absence of a number suggested either seniority or something more complicated, and Creech had neither the information nor the inclination to investigate which. She listened to his complete accounting without interrupting. When he finished, including the parts he had not transmitted, the spheres, the dwarves, the structure, the expanding anomaly field, the civilians with their inexplicable weapons. She was quiet for a moment in the particular way that Creech associated with people processing information that was reorganizing their prior understanding of a situation. "The structure appeared without hyperspace emergence," she said. "Correct. Without atmospheric entry signature." "Correct. And the entities that emerged from it, the spheres, the robed figures, they don't respond to the Force." It was not phrased as a question, which meant she already knew. Which meant she had sensed something from 3 kilometers away that had prompted the same response in her that the sensor readout had prompted in Creech, the recognition that the standard operating framework was not going to be sufficient. "What do the civilians know?" she asked. "Everything," Creech said. "They know everything. The problem is communication." Isara looked at him with an expression that said the communication problem was his to solve and she expected it to be solved before she needed to speak with the civilians directly. It was, as it happened, the young woman with the glowing crossbow bolts who solved it. She had been quiet through the night, watchful and assessing, and she had spent the morning hours in a corner of the briefing room with a piece of paper she had produced from somewhere on her person and a writing implement she had borrowed from one of the guards, filling the paper with symbols that were not basic but that had a systematic quality, the quality of someone constructing a translation framework from first principles. By the time Isara arrived and Creech brought her to the briefing room, the young woman had produced a rudimentary symbol matching system that could convey simple concepts in both directions. It was not sophisticated. It was not fast. It was, however, enough. When Isara walked into the briefing room and the young woman held up her symbol sheet, something crossed the Inquisitor's face that Creech could not read. Surprise, maybe, or the rapid recalculation of an assessment she had formed before entering the room. Mike watched Isara the way he watched everything, looking for the thing underneath the surface presentation, the tell that would tell him who she actually was and what she actually wanted. He saw the gray uniform. He saw the weapon at her hip, a cylindrical handle that he didn't recognize but that every instinct he had developed over years of survival told him was extremely dangerous. He saw the alertness, the quality of attention that swept the room and catalogued everything in it and moved on without lingering. Then she looked at him. Directly. And Mike felt something that he had felt only in proximity to the tall man himself, the sensation of being perceived at a level that bypassed the surface and went straight to whatever was underneath. As if whoever was looking at him was not looking at his face or his posture or his weapons, but at something more fundamental. Something that could not be concealed by posture or expression. He held her gaze. After a moment, something shifted in her expression. Not warmth. Not trust. But a revision of assessment in a direction that was not hostile. She said something to Creech. Creech said something back. The young woman consulted her symbol sheet and produced a careful translation. She wants to know what you know about the tall one. Mike took a slow breath. Everything, he said. And then, because the symbol sheet required simple language and simple language would not be enough for what needed to be conveyed, and none of it is going to help you. There is a particular quality of silence that occurs when the Force fails. Isara had experienced it once before, briefly, in the early months of her Inquisitor training, when her handler had used a Force-suppressing device during a session designed to teach her what dependency on the Force felt like so that she would understand, viscerally and permanently, why dependency was a vulnerability she could not afford. The device had been active for 40 seconds. 40 seconds of a silence so complete it felt like deafness, like a sound she had been hearing since birth had simply stopped, and the world without it was not quieter but wronger, a version of reality with a crucial frequency removed, the way music sounds when the bass line drops out, technically present but structurally hollow. The device had been switched off after 40 seconds. The Force had returned, rushing back in with a warmth that she had disciplined herself not to find comforting because comfort was another vulnerability and the Inquisitorius had no patience for vulnerabilities. What she felt now, standing at the edge of the anomaly field's boundary with the plantation visible in the middle distance and the morning light doing nothing useful for the atmosphere, was not the clean absence produced by a suppression device. It was something more complex and more disturbing than absence. The Force was present. She could feel it, feel the living world around her, the small creatures in the marsh grass, the distant biological signatures of the garrison personnel behind her. The Force was present and functioning and responsive to her attention in every direction except one. The direction of the plantation. In that direction, the Force did not go silent. It went wrong. It bent, somehow, in a way that her training had given her no vocabulary for. As if the space occupied by the structure and its immediate surroundings was exerting a gravitational pull on the Force itself, drawing it in and doing something to it that it was not designed to have done to it. She had stood at the edges of dark side nexuses before, places where violence or suffering had saturated the Force with shadow, and this was not that. Dark side nexuses felt like wounds. They hurt in a specific way, a moral pain, the Force registering historical atrocity as a permanent scar on the fabric of the living world. This did not hurt in that way. This did not hurt in any way she had a name for. It was simply wrong, in a register so fundamental that her mind kept sliding away from it the way a hand slides away from a surface that is too hot to touch, the reflex operating faster than the decision. She had been standing at the boundary for 11 minutes. She had not yet crossed it. Behind her, the older civilian, Reggie, she had gathered from the symbol sheet communications, a name that her basic trained ear processed as slightly absurd and then filed under irrelevant, was watching her with an expression she was coming to recognize as his default mode, patient, assessing, and containing somewhere inside it a quality of resigned compassion that she found unexpectedly difficult to categorize. He had seen her hesitate. He had not commented on it. He was waiting, she understood, for her to finish processing what she was feeling and arrive at whatever decision she was going to arrive at, because he had learned through long experience that pushing people toward the boundary before they were ready produced bad outcomes in the field. "How far does it extend?" she asked, through the young woman's translation system, which had grown more sophisticated over the past 2 hours as the young woman, whose name approximated to something Isara's ear rendered as Zoe, another filing under irrelevant, had expanded her symbol vocabulary with impressive speed. The girl had a structural mind. She was building the translation framework the way an engineer builds a load-bearing structure, starting with the foundational elements and adding complexity in layers, testing each layer before committing to the next. Reggie considered the question. Said something to Mike, who was standing to Isara's left and slightly behind her, maintaining a position that her tactical assessment identified as protective without being aggressive. He was placing himself between her and the plantation without making the placement obvious, which was either instinctive or very practiced. Mike said something back. Reggie turned to Zoe, who translated with the careful deliberateness of someone aware that precision mattered more than speed. "He says it depends on how long he's been here and whether he's decided to stop growing it or whether he's still establishing." "And which is it?" Another exchange. Zoe translated, "He doesn't know. He says when the tall man stops expanding the boundary it usually means he's found what he came for or he's decided the territory is sufficient for his purposes. When he keeps expanding it means he's still hungry." "Hungry," Isara repeated. "That's the word he used." Isara looked at the plantation. Looked at the anomaly the Force was doing in that direction, the wrong bending quality that her mind kept refusing to fully register. She thought about what the two men had told her over the past 2 hours, through Zoe's translation system, the history they had conveyed in fragments and approximations. A being from another dimension, neither living nor dead in any conventional sense, who harvested the dead of whatever world he visited and converted them to servants, who moved through dimensions at will, who could not be killed by any means they had yet discovered, who was motivated by purposes that they understood incompletely and suspected were not fully comprehensible to human minds regardless of how much exposure to them you accumulated. She thought about what she had felt at the boundary. She thought about the Force going wrong in that direction. "He feeds on the dead," she said. Not a question. Confirming her understanding of what had been translated. "Converts them," Mike said, through Zoe, with the particular emphasis of someone who found the distinction important. "He doesn't consume them. He transforms them. They become his instruments. They serve his purposes." "And the process, the conversion, does it require the body to be recently dead?" Mike looked at her with an expression that said he was revising his assessment of her in the same direction she had revised her assessment of him 40 minutes ago. He said something to Reggie. Reggie said something back, and what crossed Reggie's face when he said it was not fear exactly but the recognition that someone had asked exactly the right question and the right question was always the most frightening kind. "No," Zoe translated. "He can work with old dead. Very old. He has access to something that reanimates regardless of the condition of the remains." Isara was quiet for a moment. The Mimban marshlands had been a battlefield twice in living memory. The first time during the early Imperial period, a brief and brutal suppression of Mimbanese resistance that had cost both sides significant casualties and had been resolved with the particular finality that the Empire brought to resistance movements it considered beneath the dignity of a prolonged campaign. The second time more recently, a skirmish between Imperial forces and a rebel cell that had attempted to establish a supply depot in the northern marsh and had been discovered and destroyed before it could become operational. Both engagements had left the dead where they fell in some cases, because Mimban's terrain made recovery operations expensive and the Empire's calculus on recovery operations was purely economic. The marsh remembered its dead in the specific way that marshes do. Slowly, incompletely, preserving what the acidic water and the particular microbiology of the wetland chose to preserve. The tall man, she now understood, was not merely establishing a perimeter. He was conducting an inventory. "We need to move now," she said, and the urgency in her voice required no translation. "Not toward the plantation. Away from it. We need to evacuate this area." Mike was already moving before Zoe finished the translation, which told Isara he had read her tone correctly without needing the words. Reggie was half a step behind him. But it was Zoe who stopped, who turned back toward the boundary with an expression that Isara recognized because she had worn it herself, the expression of someone who has seen something that their mind has registered and logged and is now demanding be verified before the body is permitted to retreat. "There's someone at the boundary," Zoe said. "Not through the symbol system." Directly, in basic, with an accent that Isara's ear placed as outer rim but couldn't pin more precisely than that. Isara turned. At the boundary line, where the Louisiana mud met Mimban's marsh grass, where the transplanted Spanish moss thinned into the alien vegetation of a world that had never seen a cypress tree, a figure stood. It was tall, taller than any human had a right to be without the height becoming architectural, without the body beginning to read as a structure rather than a person. It was dressed in a black suit that was immaculate in a way that the surrounding mud and marsh should have made impossible. Its face was pale and composed in the specific way of faces that have discarded the biological need for expression because expression had been determined to be inefficient. It was looking at them. Or it was oriented toward them. The distinction, in the tall man's case, was one that Mike and Reggie had spent years trying to parse and had ultimately concluded was not parsable. The being's attention and its gaze were not necessarily the same thing, and knowing where it was looking told you nothing reliable about where it was attending. Isara reached for the Force. The Force bent away from the figure. Not violently. Not dramatically. Just, away. Like water flowing around a stone, except that the Force did not flow around things. The Force flowed through things. That was fundamental. That was definitional. The Force permeated all living things and many unliving things, and the boundary between those categories was itself a Force-permeated question. The Force did not avoid. It did not route around. The Force was the medium through which everything existed, and the idea of the Force routing around something implied that the something existed outside the medium, which was impossible. Which was what she was feeling. "Don't," Mike said. She turned to find him looking at her with an expression that was not unkind. "Whatever you're reaching for. Don't reach for it near him. He can use the connection. He can follow it back." "Follow it back to what?" Mike held her gaze. "To wherever you keep the parts of yourself you can't afford to lose." The tall man had not moved. He stood at the boundary with the patience of something that measured time in geological units, and he looked at them, or oriented toward them. And the morning light of Mimban's sun did something to his shadow that shadows were not supposed to do, which was to extend in the wrong direction, away from the light source rather than toward it, reaching back into the boundary zone with a quality that suggested the shadow was not a shadow at all but a threshold, an invitation, a door that looked like a door only if you had never seen what was on the other side of it. Then he smiled. It was the worst thing Isara had seen in a career that had required her to witness a significant number of the worst things available in the galaxy. Not because it was grotesque or violent or dark-side saturated in the way that Sith expressions of pleasure tended to be. But because it was satisfied. It was the smile of something that had assessed the board and found the configuration exactly to its liking, that had looked at the pieces arrayed against it. An Inquisitor, 2 survivors from another dimension, a girl with a translation system and a crossbow, a garrison of Imperial soldiers, the marshland full of old dead, and had performed the calculation and arrived at a result that pleased it. The shadow reached another 3 centimeters toward them. They ran. All 4 of them. In the direction of the garrison, which was not safe but was at least definitionally away from the thing at the boundary, and in situations like this one the direction that was definitionally away was always the correct first choice regardless of what lay at the end of it. Behind them, the tall man did not pursue. He didn't need to. Reggie Bannister had a theory about fear. He had developed it over the years, not through deliberate philosophical inquiry but through the accumulative pressure of experience, the way a geological formation develops not through intention but through the patient application of force over time. The theory was not sophisticated. It was not the kind of thing you could write a paper about or present at a symposium or use to impress anyone who had not spent significant portions of their life being hunted by things that should not exist. But it was true, which was the only quality Reggie had ever required of a theory. The theory was this: fear had a texture. It had a physical quality, a weight and a density that varied depending on its source, and if you paid attention to that texture over enough time and across enough sources, you began to develop a taxonomy of fears that was more useful than any intellectual framework for threat assessment, because the taxonomy was embodied, it lived in the nervous system rather than the mind, which meant it operated faster than thought and was not subject to the distortions that thought introduced. Some fears were sharp. They were the fears of immediate physical threat, the spike of adrenaline when something came at you fast from an unexpected direction, and they were useful because they were mobilizing. They made you move. They made you fast. Reggie had made peace with sharp fear years ago. Sharp fear was an ally. Some fears were deep. They were the fears of fundamental wrongness, of things that violated the categories through which you organized your understanding of what reality was and what it was permitted to contain. The tall man generated deep fear in everyone who encountered him, because the tall man was definitionally a violation of categories. He was something from outside the taxonomy of possible things, and the human nervous system's response to something outside the taxonomy of possible things was a particular species of dread that did not mobilize you, that did not make you fast, that pressed down on you with the weight of cognitive dissonance and demanded that you reconcile what you were experiencing with what you knew to be possible, which was a reconciliation that could not be made. Reggie had made peace with deep fear too, or as close to peace as you could make with something that was structurally irreconcilable. You didn't resolve it. You carried it. You carried it the way you carried a heavy pack on a long march, not by pretending it wasn't heavy, but by distributing the weight correctly and keeping moving. What he felt now, back inside the garrison with the sensor readout expanding on Creech's display and the four of them standing around the table trying to construct a plan from materials that were insufficient for the purpose, was neither sharp fear nor deep fear. It was something else. Something that he was still in the process of taxonomizing. It was the fear of a man who had been running for long enough that running had become his primary relationship with his own life, who had caught a glimpse of something that running could not resolve, and who was trying to figure out what you did instead. "He's mapping the dead," he said to Mike, through Zoe's translation. Not because Mike needed the translation but because saying it out loud, in a context where others could hear and respond, was a way of testing the idea against reality rather than just against his own internal processing. That's what the boundary expansion is. He's not establishing territory for its own sake. He's doing an inventory. The marsh is full of old dead from whatever wars happened here, and he's cataloging them. Mike nodded. He had arrived at the same conclusion 20 minutes ago and had been sitting with it, turning it over, looking at it from the angles that Reggie hadn't looked at yet. This was their dynamic, had been their dynamic for years. Reggie arrived at conclusions through action and articulation, Mike arrived at them through silence and internal processing, and the combination of both approaches produced a picture that neither of them would have assembled alone. "He brought us here for a reason," Mike said. "He doesn't move the house randomly. He chooses locations based on what they offer him." "Mimban offers him a lot of dead," Reggie said. "Mimban offers him something else too." Mike looked at Isara, who was standing across the table with her arms crossed and the focused stillness of someone listening to a conversation they couldn't fully follow and extracting what meaning they could from tone and gesture. "It offers him access to the Force." The room went quiet in a specific way. Zoe translated, watching Isara's face as she did. What crossed the Inquisitor's face was not surprise. Isara had, Reggie had decided, disciplined surprise out of her default response repertoire, but a sharpening of attention that was its functional equivalent. "He wants to interact with the Force," Isara said, Through Zoe. He wants to understand it, Mike said. Or use it. Or convert it. I don't know which. But the Force is something he doesn't have in his own dimension, and the tall man doesn't encounter things he doesn't have without trying to acquire them. Isara said something to Creech. Creech looked at his datapad. Pulled up a schematic that Reggie couldn't read but that Isara apparently could, and what she saw in it made the sharpening of her attention intensify into something that Reggie's taxonomy filed under. She's just understood something bad. She turned back to the table. Spoke to Zoe. There's a vergence, Zoe translated. A place in the marsh, approximately 2 kilometers from the plantation's current position, where the Force is unusually concentrated. Ancient. She says it predates the Imperial occupation by centuries, possibly millennia. It was noted in navigational records as a curiosity and left alone because there was no practical military application for it. She says, Zoe paused, rechecking her translation. She says the plantation's expansion pattern is oriented toward it. Whatever he's doing with the boundary is moving toward the vergence. The silence that followed was the silence of a group of people who have just had the shape of a plan they didn't know they were facing revealed to them all at once. Reggie looked at Mike. Mike looked at Reggie. He can't have it, Reggie said. No, Mike agreed. Whatever it is. Whatever he plans to do with a concentrated Force thing, the answer is he doesn't get to do it. Agreed. Which means we go to the plantation. Which means we go to the plantation, Mike confirmed, with the tone of a man confirming a dentist appointment that he has known was coming for some time and has been dreading with full knowledge that dread would not prevent its arrival. What followed was the closest thing to a tactical planning session that could be conducted between people who shared no common language, limited common experience, and a threat assessment framework that differed in virtually every particular. Reggie drove it, because driving things was what Reggie did when the alternative was waiting for something worse, and waiting for something worse had never once in his experience produced a better outcome than going toward the thing while you still had some control over the terms of engagement. The plan that emerged had the virtue of simplicity, which was the only virtue available given the constraints. It had several significant flaws, which they were all aware of and which none of them had a solution for. The flaw they talked about, they did not know the plantation's current internal configuration. The tall man rearranged his domain constantly, and the version of the Baker plantation that Mike and Reggie had escaped from in their own dimension bore only a general architectural resemblance to whatever it had become after years of the tall man's modifications. Going in meant going in without a reliable map, which meant operating by feel and by the heuristics that Mike and Reggie had developed through hard experience about how the tall man organized his spaces. The flaw they did not talk about, Isara. Specifically, what would happen to Isara inside the plantation's boundary, where the Force went wrong and bent in directions it was not designed to bend, where her primary capability and her primary sense of the world around her would be operating in conditions that had never been included in her training because the conditions were not supposed to be possible. Reggie had seen what happened to people when the tall man removed their primary coping mechanism. It was not a thing he wanted to see happen to someone he was taking into the field as an ally, however provisional and circumstantially determined the alliance was. He thought about raising it. He looked at Isara. At the disciplined composure, the quality of attention, the way she held herself with the particular uprightness of someone who had been taught that posture was a form of argument, that the body's presentation of confidence was itself a tactical asset. He thought about what it would mean to this person, who had survived something significant to arrive at the position she currently occupied, to be told that where they were going she would be diminished. He decided not to raise it. Not because he was being kind. Because he had been in enough situations to know that sometimes the most useful thing you could do for someone going into danger was let them maintain the framework that allowed them to function, because a person functioning at 80% with their framework intact was more useful than a person functioning at 60% with their framework disrupted by foreknowledge of what was coming. He would be there when the Force went wrong inside the boundary. He would deal with it then. He checked his loads. 3 shells in the 4-barrel, ate in the sawed-off heat appropriated from a supply locker after a 20-minute miming session with Creech that had ended with Creech opening the locker with the expression of a man making a decision he wasn't certain he'd be able to defend later. He had the hunting knife that had been on his belt since before the displacement, good steel, long enough to matter. He had Zoe's crossbow bolts in a bandolier across his chest, which Zoe had given him without being asked, which told him something about her threat assessment of what they were walking into. He had, as always, considerably less firepower than the situation warranted and considerably more determination than was probably rational. He had survived on this combination before. Mike was ready. Zoe was ready, crossbow loaded, her symbol sheet folded and tucked in a chest pocket where she could reach it. Isara was ready in the way that Inquisitors were ready, the cylindrical handle at her hip, her posture carrying the specific forward-angled quality of someone leaning into what was coming rather than bracing against it. Creech had volunteered 6 stormtroopers. Reggie had accepted 4, because 6 made too much noise and created too many variables, and because whatever happened inside the plantation, he wanted a margin of garrison soldiers outside it who were still functional and could provide an external reference point if the internal situation deteriorated past the point of internal solution. They left the garrison at midday, moving in a loose formation through the marsh grass, the plantation visible in the middle distance with its white columns and its black mold and its impossible Louisiana atmosphere sitting on Mimban's surface like a wound that the planet's biology had not yet found a way to respond to. The spheres started coming at 400 meters out. Reggie had expected this. The tall man never permitted uncontested approach. The approach was itself a test, a filter, a way of calibrating the threat level of whoever was coming before committing to a direct engagement. The spheres that came at 400 meters were not, Reggie judged, the full complement. They were probes, 3 of them in a staggered formation, moving at an exploratory speed rather than an attack speed. He raised the 4-barrel and waited. The first sphere adjusted its trajectory toward him specifically, which meant it had identified him as the primary threat, which meant the tall man's instruments were paying attention and reporting back. Good. Let them report. Let the tall man know who was coming. At 30 meters, Reggie fired. The sphere came apart, and its 2 companions accelerated from exploratory to attack, and behind him he heard Isara's weapon ignite for the first time. A sound unlike anything in his experience, a sharp electric crack followed by a sustained hum, and then a bar of intense coherent light swept through the space where the second sphere had been, and the sphere was no longer there, scattered in fragments across the marsh grass. He caught the 3rd sphere on the reload, the 4-barrel's 4th shell, point blank. The approach resumed. At 200 meters, the mold on the plantation's exterior walls began to move in a pattern that Reggie recognized from the Baker property in their own dimension, the slow, deliberate repositioning of the biological material that presaged a structural reconfiguration, the tall man adjusting his domain in response to incoming information. At 100 meters, the front door of the plantation opened. It opened inward. Slowly. Deliberately. The darkness inside was absolute, the way darkness is absolute when it is not merely the absence of light but the presence of something else entirely, something that had displaced the light rather than simply occupying the space where it might have been. Reggie did not slow down. "Stay together," he said, to everyone and no one, in a language 3 of his 4 companions could not understand but all 4 of them heard correctly. "No matter what you see. No matter what it says. Stay together." He went through the door first. The interior of the Baker plantation had never been stable, even in its original configuration, even before the tall man had claimed it and begun the long process of converting it from a place where people had lived into a place where something else entirely conducted its business. The rooms shifted. The hallways extended or contracted depending on the tall man's purposes. Doors appeared in walls that had not previously contained doors, and doors that you had walked through moments before became sections of wall when you tried to walk back through them. The architecture was not fixed. It was expressive, a physical manifestation of the tall man's will, responsive to his attention the way a face is responsive to the emotions moving through the mind behind it. Mike had mapped these patterns over years of unwilling familiarity. Not cartographically. Any map you made of the plantation's interior was obsolete before the ink dried, but heuristically. There were principles that held even when the specific configurations didn't. The tall man always maintained a path to the dimensional gateway, because the gateway was his access point, his supply line, his connection to the dimension from which he drew the materials for his work. The path to the gateway was never the obvious path, never the straight line between here and there, always the route that required passage through the maximum number of intermediate spaces. The spaces where his servants operated, where his processes were conducted, where the conversion of the dead into instruments of his will was carried out. The tall man did not make things easy to reach. He made them survivable to reach, for whoever he wanted to survive reaching them, because the tall man's gateway was also a trap, and traps required bait to enter them voluntarily. Mike understood this and went in anyway, because the alternative was letting the tall man have the vergence, and whatever a vergence was, whatever concentrated force energy meant in practical terms, he had seen what the tall man did with power sources that didn't belong to him, and the answer was always the same and always terrible. The foyer was intact, which was itself information. The tall man left the foyer intact in configurations where he wanted visitors to feel oriented, to feel the false comfort of a recognizable space before the disorientation began. The foyer's original Baker family furnishings were present, the mahogany side table, the tarnished mirror, the coat hooks on which no coats hung. And they were wrong in the specific way that things in the plantation were always wrong, the wrongness not in any individual object but in the relationship between objects, the distances slightly off, the angles not quite consistent with a single coherent light source, the shadows behaving with the same geometric independence that the tall man's shadow had demonstrated at the boundary. Isara moved through the foyer with her weapon, her lightsaber. Reggie had named it in his head, because it was a sword made of light, and naming things was how he maintained cognitive purchase on situations that resisted comprehension, ignited and held in a guard position that was clearly trained and instinctive, her body moving with the muscle memory of extensive practice. She was using it as a light source as much as a weapon, which was intelligent. The blade cast a red illumination that pushed back the plantation's particular darkness without eliminating it, the way a campfire pushes back wilderness darkness without eliminating it, a sphere of comprehensible space surrounded by incomprehensibility. She was also, Reggie noted, touching the walls with her free hand as she moved. Not for physical support. Lightly, briefly, fingertips making contact and withdrawing. Testing something. Reading something. "She's feeling for the Force," Zoe said quietly, close to Reggie's left shoulder. She had been watching Isara with the same quality of focused attention she brought to everything, the same structural curiosity that had produced the translation system in a single night. "She's trying to find it in here." "Is she finding it?" Zoe watched for another moment. "She's finding something. I don't think it's what she's looking for." The hallway beyond the foyer was not the hallway Reggie remembered from their entry into the plantation in their own dimension. It was longer. The wallpaper, a faded floral pattern that the Baker family had chosen at some point in a domestic past that felt impossibly remote from the current situation, had developed a quality of movement in the peripheral vision, not moving when you looked directly at it but definitely moving when you didn't, a slow rhythmic pulse that corresponded to nothing external. The mold was present here in greater density than in the foyer, running in dark veins along the baseboard and the ceiling junction, and the mold was doing the thing it always did inside the plantation's deeper spaces, breathing. There was no other word for it. The biological material expanded and contracted at intervals that were not consistent with any known respiratory pattern but that the nervous system nevertheless registered as breath, as the inhalation and exhalation of something vast using the building's walls as its lungs. One of the stormtroopers said something short and tight. Creech's soldiers had maintained their professional composure through the approach and through the foyer, which Reggie credited to their training and to the specific psychological architecture of Imperial military conditioning, which prioritized operational function over emotional response to a degree that Reggie found both admirable and concerning. The tight comment from the rearmost trooper was the first crack in that composure, and it was a small crack, a hairline fracture, but Reggie noted it and filed it. "Keep moving," he said. to himself as much as anyone. The first dwarf servant came from the ceiling. It dropped into the hallway between Reggie and the two stormtroopers at the rear, and it was fast in the way they were always fast, the converted body moving with a complete absence of self-preservation that made it unpredictable in the specific way that unpredictable was most dangerous. Not erratic, not random, but indifferent to consequences in a way that human opponents were never quite indifferent, because human opponents always retained some fraction of biological self-interest that could be exploited. The dwarf servants had no self-interest. They had only direction and velocity. The rearmost stormtrooper fired twice and missed both times, because the servant was already inside the angle of the weapon by the time the trigger was pulled, and missing at that range was not a failure of marksmanship but a failure of physics, the geometry simply not available for the shot. The second stormtrooper clubbed it with the stock of his rifle, which was imprecise and sufficient. The impact knocked it sideways into the wall, and Reggie put his boot on it and the hunting knife through the back of its neck before it could reorient. It stopped. They always stopped when you destroyed the head. Mike had the sawed-off up and was covering the ceiling above them, moving the barrel in a slow sweep. "How many more points of entry?" he called back. To Reggie, to the space, to whoever had relevant information. "Every surface," Reggie said. "Treat every surface as a potential entry point." Isara said something. Zoe translated, "She says she can feel them. The converted ones. She can feel them in the Force but they're wrong, she says they feel like they're present and absent at the same time. Like something is wearing them." "That's exactly what it is," Mike said, still covering the ceiling. "That's exactly what he does. There's nothing left of whoever they were. He hollows them out and fills them with his purpose. The body is just a vehicle." Isara was quiet for a moment after Zoe translated this. Then she said something short, and Zoe's translation was equally short. She says she understands that better than she would like to. They moved deeper. The kitchen was unrecognizable. Not because it had been physically altered, though it had been, the appliances relocated in configurations that served no culinary purpose, the floor replaced with something that was not wood and not tile and that gave slightly underfoot in a way that Reggie did not investigate, but because of what occupied the central space. 3 figures stood in a loose triangle in the middle of the kitchen, motionless, robed in the brown fabric that the tall man used for his converted servants. But these were not dwarves. These were full-sized. 2 of them wore the remnants of Imperial Stormtrooper armor beneath the robes, white plastoid visible at the shoulders and chest, the Imperial cog insignia still present on one pauldron, incongruous against the brown fabric draped over it. The third wore nothing under the robe, was simply a body in a brown robe, a human body in the specific neutral state of something that had been a person and was no longer. Patrol 7, Reggie understood. Or part of it. The standing stormtrooper behind him made a sound that the armor muffled but that Reggie heard clearly enough: recognition, horror, the specific grief of identifying someone you knew inside a configuration that made the identification a violation rather than a comfort. "Don't," Reggie said, before the trooper could move. "I know. I know what you're seeing. But whatever was in there isn't in there anymore. What's in there now serves him. And it will not hesitate." The 3 figures turned simultaneously, with the mechanical precision of instruments receiving a signal, orienting toward the group with a speed that suggested the stillness had been performed rather than genuine. Not waiting but ready, the distinction between those states collapsed by whatever had replaced the biological will that would normally maintain it. Mike fired first. The sawed-off took the nearest converted trooper in the upper chest and knocked it backward into the kitchen counter, and it was down but not finished, pulling itself upright with the patient mechanical determination of something that did not register damage the way living things register damage. Reggie put the 4-barrel's second shell through its head at 4 feet and it stayed down. Isara moved through the remaining 2 with a speed and economy that Reggie filed in the part of his assessment taxonomy reserved for things he was glad were on his side. The lightsaber was precise. Not theatrical, not the sweeping arcs he might have expected from a weapon of that configuration, but tight and deliberate, the blade used at close quarters with the same disciplined efficiency that a trained knife fighter uses a blade, minimizing the exposure of the weapon to being grabbed or deflected. The two converted servants were down in 4 seconds. She stood over them, breathing evenly, and looked at what remained. The brown robes. The white armor. She said something very quietly that Zoe, standing at the kitchen doorway, did not translate immediately. When Reggie looked at her, she met his eyes and translated with the careful neutrality of someone relaying a statement they understood was important but did not yet have full context for. She says, "This is what he does to soldiers." "Yes," Reggie said. She says she has seen something like it before. She says the Sith do something similar. They hollow people out and fill them with purpose that isn't theirs. Then she understands what we're up against. Zoe translated. Isara listened. Then she said something else, and this time what crossed her face when she said it was not the disciplined neutrality she had maintained through everything up to this point but something more honest, something that had gotten through the discipline and was expressing itself despite it. Zoe translated, she says. The difference is that the Sith leave enough of the person intact to suffer. She says she's not sure which is worse. Reggie thought about the tall man. About the years of pursuit. About everyone he had lost to the conversion process, everyone he had watched disappear into the brown robes and the diminished form, everyone he had grieved and then been forced to fight because grief and combat occupied the same space in the tall man's economy and there was no room for them to be sequential. I've thought about that question, he said. I don't have an answer. Zoe translated. Isara listened. Then she extinguished her lightsaber briefly, 1 second of darkness, the darkness of the plantation pressing in from every surface, and reignited it, and the gesture had the quality of a decision being made, a framework being adopted, a person choosing to move forward not because the path was clear but because standing still in a place like this was the only choice worse than moving. They found the stairs to the lower level behind a door that had not existed in the Baker Plantation's original architecture. It was new construction, or new manifestation, because the tall man did not construct in any conventional sense. A door in a wall that had previously been solid, opening onto a staircase that descended at an angle slightly too steep to be comfortable, the tread slightly too narrow for a normal human stride, every dimension calibrated to produce the low-level physical discomfort that kept attention fractured between the environment and the threat. From below, rising up the stairwell with the particular quality of sound that enclosed spaces give to things that should not be making sounds in enclosed spaces, came the hum of the dimensional gateway. Mike's jaw tightened. Reggie recognized the expression, the specific recalibration of someone who has been dreading a thing and is now close enough to it that dread is giving way to resolve, the transition that is never comfortable but that is always necessary. He knows we're here, Mike said. He's been watching since the foyer. He let us get this far because he wants us down there. I know, Reggie said. It's a trap. I know. We're going anyway. We're going anyway, Reggie confirmed. He looked at the stairwell. At the light rising from below, not the red of Isara's lightsaber but something else, something with a frequency that sat wrong against the eye, a light that illuminated without warming, that revealed without clarifying. He always thinks the trap is the end of it. He's been wrong every time. He descended first. Because that was what he did. Because someone had to, and it was always going to be him. The basement of the Baker Plantation had not existed in the original structure. This was not unusual. The tall man regularly appended spaces to whatever physical structure he chose to occupy. Not through construction but through a process that Mike had spent years trying to find language for and had ultimately settled on calling extrusion, because the new spaces seemed to emerge from the existing structure the way a material extrudes through a die, forced through an opening in the boundary between what the building was and what the tall man required it to be. The basement had been extruded from the Louisiana soil and the Mimban marsh beneath it, a hybridized space that belonged fully to neither geology, its walls a composite of red-brown Louisiana clay and Mimban's gray-green sediment compressed together in layers that had no business being adjacent and yet were, The two materials interpenetrating at their boundary in a way that suggested they had been forced into contact under pressure sufficient to make them forget they were different things. The gateway occupied the center of the space. Mike had seen it before, in various configurations. The tall man's dimensional portal was not a fixed object but a variable phenomenon, its physical expression shaped by the available materials and the specific requirements of the transition being facilitated. In their own dimension it had manifested as a corridor of charged air, a zone of dimensional instability that produced a visible shimmer and a sound at the edge of human hearing, a frequency so low it registered as pressure rather than sound, felt in the chest and the sinuses rather than heard by the ears. Here it had taken a different form. Here it was a column of light rising from the basement floor to the ceiling and beyond, passing through the ceiling without interrupting it, presumably continuing upward through every floor of the plantation and into the Mimban sky above. The light was the same wrong frequency Reggie had observed from the stairwell, illuminating without warming, revealing without clarifying. And it rotated slowly around its vertical axis, not the light itself rotating but the quality of the light, the wrongness cycling through its available expressions in a slow patient progression that was almost meditative in its rhythm. Around the base of the column, arranged with a precision that was clearly intentional rather than coincidental, were 12 figures. 8 of them were dwarves in brown robes. The tall man's standard conversion product, the template he returned to when efficiency was the priority over other considerations. But 4 of them were something Reggie had not seen before, and the novelty of it in the context of everything else he had survived hit him with a specific quality of dread that his taxonomy filed immediately as, new category, threat level unknown, treat as maximum until data available. They were tall. Human proportioned, or close to it, but assembled with the same wrongness that characterized all of the tall man's products, the distances slightly off, the angles inconsistent, the shadow behavior independent of the light source. They wore no robes. They wore instead a kind of carapace, biological in appearance but clearly not biological in origin, a hard external structure that covered the torso and upper limbs and that had, at several points along its surface, the gleaming protrusions of sphere casings integrated directly into the flesh. Not attached. Integrated. The spheres had been incorporated into the bodies at the conversion stage, built in rather than added after, which meant these were not recent conversions of existing dead but purpose-built instruments, designed from the conversion point up for a specific function. Reggie looked at the sphere casings built into their shoulders and chests and understood the function immediately. They launch, he said quietly. To Mike, who had arrived at the same conclusion approximately 2 seconds earlier and was already repositioning to get a wall at his back. From the body, Mike confirmed. Without needing to be thrown. They're self-propelled deployment systems. He built them for this engagement. He built them for us, Mike corrected. Specifically for us. He's been watching how we fight for 20 years. These are the countermeasures. The 12 figures around the gateway column were motionless in the same performed way that the kitchen figures had been motionless. Not waiting but ready, the distinction collapsed, the stillness a loaded state rather than an empty one. They were oriented toward the stairwell. They had been expecting arrival from that direction. Which meant the tall man had known since the foyer, had tracked the group's progress through every room, and had deployed his resources in response to real-time intelligence about what was coming. This was also not new. The tall man always knew where you were in his domain. The domain was his sensory apparatus as much as it was his operational environment. What was new was Isara. She came down the stairwell last, having held the rear while the group descended, and when she stepped off the final tread into the basement she stopped completely. Not because she was assessing the tactical situation, though she was also doing that. She stopped because the gateway column was doing something to the force that she had not anticipated and was not, Reggie could see, in the process of successfully managing. The column of wrong light was not merely bending the force in this space. It was drawing it. Actively, with the focused intentionality of a system that had been designed for exactly this purpose. The force was moving toward the column the way iron filings move toward a magnet, not being destroyed, not being suppressed, but being redirected, pulled from its natural distribution through the living world and concentrated at the column's surface where it disappeared into the dimensional transition with the rest of the column's contents. Isara was connected to the Force. Inextricably, fundamentally, in the way that her entire operational capability and her entire perceptual framework were built on that connection. And the gateway was pulling the Force. Which meant the gateway was pulling at her, at the thing she was most essentially, with a force, physical force, gravitational in quality, that she was visibly, physically resisting. Her lightsaber was still ignited. Her posture was still correct. But the hand that held the weapon was not entirely steady, and the quality of her stillness was the stillness of someone bracing against a current rather than the stillness of someone who had chosen to be still. Mike saw it. Moved to her position without announcing the movement, without drawing attention to what he was doing, placed himself between her and the column and said very quietly, to Zoe, tell her to focus on something physical. Something she can touch. Tell her not to reach for the Force right now, let the Force be what it's going to be and don't try to hold on to it. Zoe translated, close to Isara's ear, barely audible. Isara looked at Mike. Something complex moved through her expression. Resistance first, the resistance of someone being told to relinquish their primary tool in a situation that clearly required tools, followed by a very fast and very honest assessment of what she was currently able to do with that tool in these conditions, followed by the acceptance that was harder than the resistance because acceptance required admitting a limitation, and admitting limitations was something the Inquisitorius had trained out of its members with great thoroughness. She looked at the wall beside her. Put her free hand flat against it, palm and fingers in full contact with the cold composite of Louisiana clay and Mimban sediment. Focused on the physical reality of the surface beneath her hand. And the tremor in her weapon hand stilled, not completely but enough to function, which was all that had ever been required. Thank you, she said, in basic, without waiting for translation. Looking at Mike directly. Mike nodded once. The 12 figures around the gateway column moved. What followed was not, in any conventional sense, a battle. Battles had structure, they had phases, they had momentum, they had moments of advantage and disadvantage that could be tracked and responded to. What happened in the basement of the Baker Plantation was something more like a sustained negotiation with chaos, conducted at close quarters, in wrong light, against opponents that did not respond to damage the way opponents were supposed to respond to damage, with a group of 5 people and 2 stormtroopers who had different capabilities and different training and no common language and approximately 30 seconds of shared operational experience. Reggie went straight at the nearest sphere-integrated figure because going straight at things was the correct response when things were already moving toward you and hesitation gave them the initiative. He fired the 4 barrels' third shell at its chest, which was where the sphere casing was most prominent, on the theory that the mechanism for launching the spheres had to be located somewhere in the body, and disrupting the chest architecture was more likely to disrupt the launch mechanism than targeting any other region. The shell hit. The figure staggered. The sphere in its right shoulder launched anyway, spinning out on a trajectory that took it past Reggie's left ear at a distance he did not measure because measuring it would have required him to stop moving, and stopping was not available. Mike caught the sphere with the sawed-off on a reflex that had been built over years of exactly this kind of engagement, the trigger pull happening faster than conscious decision because the conscious decision framework had long since been bypassed in favor of the somatic memory that was faster and more reliable. The sphere detonated. The figure Reggie had shot was still moving, and he hit it again with the 4 barrels' 4th shell, the last one, and this time it went down, and the thing in the shoulder that would have launched a second sphere made a grinding mechanical sound and stopped. On his left, Isara was fighting with the particular focused economy she had demonstrated in the kitchen but adapted now to the basement's constraints. Less room, more opponents, the gateway column's pull adding a directional bias to every movement she made toward it, a constant lean she was compensating for. She was good. Reggie allowed himself the fraction of attention required to form that assessment and then redirected the rest to his own situation. She was genuinely good, trained to a standard that his long experience with human capability recognized as exceptional, and she was doing it while managing a perceptual environment that was actively working against her fundamental sensory framework. He filed this under assets, high value, protect accordingly. One of the stormtroopers went down. Not dead. Reggie checked in his peripheral vision and the man was moving, pulling himself toward the wall, which meant functional rather than finished, but out of the engagement. The other stormtrooper was firing continuously at the dwarf servants, a sustained suppression that was not killing them but was disrupting their movement patterns and buying the space that the rest of the group needed to operate. Zoe, who Reggie had assessed as civilian and non-combatant and had been unconsciously protecting that assessment against the evidence, disabused him of it with complete efficiency. The crossbow she carried fired its glowing bolts with a speed that the weapon's manual loading configuration should not have permitted. She was either operating it faster than physics recommended or the weapon had an internal mechanism he hadn't observed. And the bolts, when they struck the converted figures, did not simply penetrate. They disrupted. The glow in the bolt's shaft transferred to the target on impact, spreading through the converted tissue in a pattern that looked almost biological, like an infection moving through a bloodstream, and where the glow spread the converted tissue ceased to function. Not destroyed. Switched off. Reggie stared at this for approximately half a second. What are those bolts? He asked, to no one specifically. I don't know, Zoe said, reloading with practiced speed. I've had them since before I came here. They work on things that shouldn't be able to be stopped. That's a useful quality in a bolt, Reggie said. I've found that. The 8 dwarf servants were down, 5 to Isara, 2 to the stormtroopers sustained fire, 1 to Zoe's crossbow. 3 of the 4 sphere-integrated figures were down, 2 to Reggie's 4-barrel in combination with Isara's lightsaber, 1 to a coordinated engagement between Mike's sawed-off and Zoe's bolts that had required 3 passes but had ultimately succeeded. The 4th sphere-integrated figure was between Reggie and the gateway column, and it was not moving toward him. It was moving toward the column. Moving toward the column with the deliberate unhurried pace of something executing a previously determined instruction regardless of what was happening around it. Mike saw it. It's going to go through, he said. It's going to take something through to the other side. What does that mean? Zoe asked. What's on the other side? Mike looked at the column. At the wrong light rotating through its available wrongnesses. At the figure moving toward it with its built-in sphere casings and its performed purpose and the thing it was carrying that it had been carrying since before they entered the basement, that it had been holding in its converted hands the whole time, that none of them had identified until this moment because they had been focused on the threat the figures represented and not on what the figures were transporting. It was carrying a piece of something. A fragment. Dark, irregular, crystalline in structure, throwing back the column's light in frequencies that the light had not entered it with. It had been harvested from somewhere in the marsh, from the vergence that Isara had identified, from the concentrated force energy that the tall man had been mapping the dead toward, from the target that the boundary expansion had been oriented at all along. He had already reached it. While they had been inside the plantation. While they had been fighting their way through the foyer and the hallway and the kitchen and down the stairs with their too narrow treads. Outside, in the marsh, the boundary had completed its expansion to the vergence, and the tall man had harvested from it, and the harvest was in this figure's hands, and if it went through the gateway it would go back to the tall man's dimension and whatever he intended to do with a piece of crystallized force energy he would do it there where none of them could follow. Reggie had no loaded shells. Mike had no loaded shells. Isara was on the wrong side of the remaining 3 figures between her and the sphere-integrated carrier. Zoe raised the crossbow. The bolt left the crossbow at a distance of 11 meters. Reggie watched it travel. Or rather, his nervous system registered the travel in the compressed temporal experience that extreme situations produce, the subjective slowing that is not actually a slowing but a densification of attention, every available perceptual resource redirected toward the single event that matters most, the processing happening faster than normal so that the interval between stimulus and response feels elongated even as the clock continues at its standard rate. He had experienced this compression many times. It was one of the things fear did when it was working correctly, when it was operating as the mobilizing tool it was designed to be rather than the paralytic one it became when it overwhelmed the system that was supposed to be managing it. The bolt struck the sphere-integrated figure in the lower back, at the junction between the carapace and the unconverted flesh below it, and the glow transferred in the pattern he had observed before. Spreading through the converted tissue in the infection-like progression that moved faster through dense material and slower through the sphere casings, which appeared to have some quality that resisted the bolt's effect without fully blocking it. The figure's legs lost function first. It went down to its knees on the basement floor, maintaining its grip on the crystalline fragment through the initial impact and through the first 2 seconds of the bolt's effect, the converted hands not releasing the thing they had been instructed to carry because release required a decision and decision required a self, and the tall man's instruments had no self to make decisions with. But on the 3rd second, as the glow reached the upper limbs, the hands opened. The fragment hit the basement floor. In the silence that followed the fragment's impact, a silence that was not actually silence but that was quiet enough relative to the preceding 40 seconds to register as silence. 6 people and 1 incapacitated stormtrooper reassessed their situation simultaneously and from 6 different frameworks, and the reassessment produced 6 different emotional responses that were nevertheless all variations on the same fundamental theme, which was, "It is not over." Mike crossed the basement floor to the fragment in 4 strides, crouched over it without touching it. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked at Isara, who had crossed to the same position from the opposite direction and was also looking at it, but with the additional quality of someone who could perceive things about the object that Mike's senses could not access. "What is it?" he asked, through Zoe. Isara spoke. Her voice had the careful measured quality of someone describing something at the edge of their descriptive vocabulary. Reaching for language that approximated an experience that language had not been designed to carry. Zoe translated with the same care. "She says it's a shard. From the vergence. She says the vergence was a nexus point, a place where the force concentrated naturally, over millennia, the way water concentrates in a low point in the landscape. She says whatever lived near the vergence over those millennia left impressions in it. She says it's layered. Centuries of living things, their experiences, their deaths, their connection to the force, compressed into the physical material of the nexus point the way sediment is compressed into stone." "And he took a piece of it," Mike said. "He took a piece of it," Zoe confirmed. "Can he use it?" Zoe translated. Isara looked at the fragment. Reached out toward it with her free hand, not touching it, holding her palm approximately 6 inches above its surface. Her expression underwent something that Reggie had not seen on it before, not the disciplined neutrality, not the sharp focus, not the honest admission of limitation that she had shown when the gateway's pull had destabilized her. What crossed her face was something older and quieter, a quality he associated with people who had encountered something that reached past their professional frameworks and made contact with the person underneath. She said something. Zoe was quiet for a moment before translating. "She says she can feel the dead in it. All the dead that the vergence absorbed over the centuries. She says they're not gone. She says the force doesn't discard. Whatever lived and died near that vergence, whatever gave itself to the force at the moment of death, it's in the material. It's present." She paused. Isara was still speaking. "She says if he takes this through the gateway and does to it what he does to bodies. If he converts what's in the material, if he hollows out the centuries of dead and fills the shard with his own purpose, she says she doesn't know what it would produce, but she says it would be a weapon unlike anything the galaxy has encountered." The gateway column continued its slow rotation of wrongness in the center of the basement. The wrong light cycled. The dimensional pull that it exerted on the force, and on Isara, through the force, was if anything stronger than it had been when they descended the stairs, which Reggie interpreted as the gateway being more fully operational than it had been then, more committed to its function, drawing more aggressively on whatever dimensional mechanics governed its operation. The tall man was feeding it. Reggie understood this without being told. The boundary expansion, the mapping of the dead, the harvesting of the Vergence shard, it had all been in service of this. The gateway was not simply a transit point. It was a processor. It was the mechanism through which the tall man intended to convert the Vergence shard, using the dimensional transition itself as the conversion process, the passage through the gateway doing to the force-saturated material what the tall man's more conventional processes did to biological remains. "We have to destroy the gateway," Mike said. "Not close it. Destroy it." He said this with the flatness of someone stating something they have known for a long time and have been postponing stating because stating it made it real and making it real meant dealing with what came after. Reggie looked at the gateway column. At the wrong light. At the dimensional mechanics churning inside it with the patient efficiency of a process that had been running for a very long time across a very large number of dimensions and had developed, through that long experience, a comprehensive resistance to interruption. "We've never destroyed one before," he said. "No. We've closed them. Destabilized them. Forced them to collapse. Yes. But never destroyed." "No," Mike said again. "And then, but we've never had one of these before." He looked at Isara. At the lightsaber in her hand. At the blade of coherent energy that operated on principles he did not understand but that he had watched cut through the tall man's converted instruments with an efficiency that nothing in their own arsenal had ever matched. He looked at the fragment on the floor. At the centuries of force-saturated dead compressed into its crystalline structure. He looked at Isara and said something to Zoe, and Zoe translated it, and what Isara's face did when she heard the translation was the thing that told Reggie the plan was either exactly right or exactly wrong and there was no available information to determine which. "He wants to know," Zoe said, "if the dead in the fragment are still present enough to choose." Isara looked at the fragment for a long time. Her hand was still hovering above it, palm down, 6 inches of distance. The gateway's pull was working on her in the specific way it had been working on her since they descended, and she was managing it with the physical anchor technique Mike had given her, the flat hand on the wall replaced now by an internal version of the same practice, the concentration on somatic reality as a counterweight to the dimensional distortion. She was managing it, but the management cost something, and what it cost was visible in the set of her jaw and the precise economy of every movement she made, the conservation of resource that happens when resource is genuinely limited. She said something. Zoe translated, "She says she doesn't know. She says the Force doesn't work the way he's describing, the dead don't persist in the Force as individual consciousnesses capable of choice. They become part of the whole. They lose the individuality that choice requires." Mike nodded. He had expected this. "But the material isn't the Force," he said. "The material is a physical record. A compression. Like a," he looked at Reggie, searching for the analogy. "Like a recording," Reggie said. "Like the information is still there even if the person isn't." Zoe translated. Isara listened. She looked at the fragment again, and her hovering hand dropped the final 6 inches and made contact with the fragment's surface. What happened was not dramatic. There was no light, no sound, no visible phenomenon of any kind. Isara's hand rested on the fragment and she was still, with the absolute stillness of someone experiencing something that required every available unit of attention to experience and had none left over for the maintenance of physical activity. The stillness lasted 11 seconds. Reggie counted. Then she lifted her hand from the fragment and looked at Mike and said 4 words that Zoe translated without hesitation because they required no deliberation. "They remember being alive." Mike picked up the fragment. The plan was not sophisticated. Sophisticated plans required time and resources and communication infrastructure that the situation did not provide. What the situation provided was a gateway that needed to be destroyed, a fragment of force-saturated material that the gateway's own mechanics had been designed to process, and a weapon that could theoretically make a dimensional gateway catastrophically unstable if introduced into its operational core at the correct angle with the correct intent. Mike held the fragment. Isara held the lightsaber. Reggie reloaded, 3 shells from the bandolier across his chest, because whatever happened next he was not going to be without loaded weapons when it happened. The tall man arrived as they positioned themselves around the gateway column, in the way he always arrived, not through a door, not from a direction, but from a quality of the air that changed without changing, a presence that the space contained and then a presence that the space was structured around. He was there and then he had always been there, the impossibility of his arrival retroactively corrected so that the memory of the moment before he was present blurred and the present moment in which he was simply always present became the only available reality. He was tall. He was immaculate. His shadow went in the wrong direction. He looked at the 3 of them, at Mike holding the fragment, at Isara with the lightsaber, at Reggie with the 4-barrel, at Zoe with the crossbow. And his expression did the thing it always did, which was to register the situation with complete clarity and produce in response neither fear nor anger but a kind of vast, considered patience, the patience of something that operated across timescales that made this moment, this resistance, this specific configuration of opposition, feel less like a threat and more like a weather event. Temporary. Local. Ultimately irrelevant to the larger pattern. He spoke. His voice in the plantation's basement had the same quality it always had, resonant, layered, carrying the acoustic signature of something that was not using human vocal anatomy to produce human sounds but was producing sounds that human anatomy could register, the translation happening in the production rather than in the reception. Zoe looked at him. She was the only one who had not positioned herself relative to the gateway. She was standing apart from the group, crossbow raised, and she was looking at the tall man with an expression that Reggie had not seen on her face before and that he found, in the compressed temporal experience of the moment, impossible to fully read. "He's saying something," she said. "Can you understand him?" Reggie asked. "No," Zoe said. "But I can feel what he means." A pause. "He's saying this doesn't matter. He's saying the fragment is one shard from one vergence on one world. He's saying there are more. He's saying the galaxy has been accumulating force-saturated sites for 25,000 years and he has all the time he requires to visit each of them. He's saying we haven't stopped anything," Mike said. "Not a question. He's saying we've delayed something," Zoe said. "He's saying delay is not defeat." Mike looked at the gateway column. At the wrong light. At the dimensional mechanics churning inside it with their patient terrible efficiency. He looked at the fragment in his hands. At the centuries of the dead compressed into its crystalline structure. At the shard surface catching the gateway's light and throwing it back changed, throwing it back in frequencies the light had not entered it with, because the material was not passive, because the force-saturated record of centuries of living and dying was not a neutral medium through which energy passed unchanged. He looked at Isara. "Now," he said. Isara drove the lightsaber into the gateway column's base. And Mike pressed the fragment against the column's surface at the point where the lightsaber entered it. And the gateway, which had been designed to convert force-saturated material through dimensional transition, began converting the force-saturated material it had been given. The centuries of dead in the fragment moved through the gateway's conversion process. And the gateway's conversion process, which had been calibrated to strip force connection from material and redirect it to the tall man's purposes, encountered force connection that did not strip. Force connection that had been set in the material by the long slow patient accumulation of lives willingly given to the force at the moment of death, connection that was not held by individual consciousness and therefore could not be seized by a process that worked by seizing consciousness, connection that was distributed through the material in the way that the force itself was distributed through the living galaxy, everywhere at once. Too diffuse to grasp, too fundamental to redirect, too much of everything to be taken from anything. The gateway began to fail. It failed loudly. The wrong light stopped cycling and went instead to a single frequency and held it, and the frequency was wrong in a new way, a way that registered in the body as the specific physical discomfort of something operating outside its designed parameters, a machine running at a temperature it was not rated for, the dimensional mechanics straining against a load they had not been engineered to carry. The pull on Isara intensified for 3 seconds. She braced, feet planted, the physical anchor now literal and somatic and absolute, the hand on the lightsaber's hilt white-knuckled and present, and then reversed, the pull becoming a push, the gateway expelling rather than drawing, and the expulsion was not orderly. The tall man moved for the first time. Toward the gateway. Not toward them. Toward the gateway, with the specific purposeful speed of something that has assessed a situation and determined that intervention in one location is more valuable than intervention in another. He moved through the space between them with the complete indifference to physical obstacles that had always characterized his movement. Not around Reggie but through the space Reggie occupied, or through a version of the space, the tall man's relationship to physical space being one of the many things about him that Mike and Reggie had catalogued under cannot be fully explained, treat as axiom and proceed. Reggie fired anyway. Because you always fired. Because the alternative to firing was accepting a passivity that he had never once in his life accepted and was not going to start accepting in the basement of a displaced Louisiana plantation on a swamp moon in a galaxy that was not his own. 2 shells. Both hit. Both registered on the tall man's immaculate suit as impacts, the fabric distorting at the impact points in ways that suggested the force had transmitted somewhere, not through, not past, not deflected, but somewhere, to some tissue or structure that existed in whatever configuration the tall man's body actually occupied when it chose to be present in a given location. The tall man reached the gateway. Put both hands into the wrong light. And pushed. The gateway column collapsed inward, and then outward, and then performed a spatial operation that had no name in any human geometry, folding through dimensions in a sequence that the human visual system was not equipped to track and that the human nervous system registered as a brief, complete, total wrongness. A moment in which every sensory input simultaneously reported something that could not be reconciled with any prior experience, a moment of pure perceptual chaos from which the mind emerged on the other side with the desperate, grateful rigidity of a system that has been briefly without a framework and has seized the nearest available replacement with both hands. When the moment passed, the gateway column was gone. The wrong light was gone. The dimensional pull on Isara was gone. The basement was lit only by the red of Isara's lightsaber, held steady now, the hand that held it no longer managing a current because the current had stopped. The tall man was gone. The fragment was gone. Mike was on his knees in the space where the gateway column had been, both hands empty, looking at the floor of the basement where the fragment had been and where there was now nothing except the composite of Louisiana clay and Mimban sediment, undisturbed, as if nothing had ever rested there. The silence lasted a long time. Reggie broke it, because silences in the tall man's domain had a way of filling themselves with things you did not want to have fill them, and filling them first with something human was always the better option. Did we win? He asked. To the room. To Mike. To Isara with her steady lightsaber. To Zoe, who was lowering her crossbow with the careful deliberateness of someone ensuring a safety that the weapon may or may not have had. Nobody answered immediately. Then Mike looked up from the floor, from the empty space where the fragment had been, from the composite geology of 2 worlds compressed together under the tall man's impossible pressure, and he said, with the honesty of someone who had learned through long experience that dishonest answers to this question were always more expensive than honest ones. We stopped him getting what he came for. This time. The plantation began to die at dawn. Not dramatically. Not with the sudden catastrophic collapse that might have been narratively satisfying, the structure folding in on itself in a cascade of dimensional withdrawal, the Louisiana mud retreating back to wherever it had come from and leaving Mimban's native geology intact and uncontested. It died the way things die when the animating principle sustaining them has withdrawn. Gradually, incrementally, with a kind of exhausted settling that was more biological than architectural, more organic decline than structural failure. The mold on the exterior walls stopped moving first. The rhythmic pulse that had given it its breathing quality stilled and the mold became simply mold, a biological material without animating intelligence, beginning the passive process of dying that mold undergoes when the conditions that sustained it are no longer present. Then the windows went dark, the faint luminescence that had pulsed at irregular intervals from somewhere deep within the structure extinguishing section by section from the basement upward, like a nervous system shutting down from the extremities toward the core. Then the Spanish moss on the transplanted cypress trees lost whatever quality had distinguished it from genuine Spanish moss and became genuine Spanish moss, real and dead in the wrong climate, the gray-green strands beginning the slow desiccation that would reduce them to nothing within a day. The plantation was still standing. The physical structure remained. But it was standing the way a body stands when rigor mortis has set in. Present, technically intact, but absent in the fundamental way that distinguished a body from a person, the architecture without the animating purpose that had made it something more than a collection of materials in a particular configuration. Mike stood on the sagging back porch and watched the mold stop moving and felt something that was not quite relief and not quite grief and not quite exhaustion, though it contained elements of all three. He had watched things connected to the tall man die before. He had watched dimensional structures collapse and gateways close and the tall man's domain retract from spaces it had occupied, and he had never once felt unambiguous triumph at any of it, because unambiguous triumph required a finality that the tall man never provided. The tall man withdrew. The tall man relocated. The tall man continued, across dimensions and timescales that made the concept of defeat functionally inapplicable to him. You did not defeat the tall man. You survived him. You stopped specific things he was trying to do in specific places at specific times, and the stopping was real and the stopping mattered, but the war behind the stopping was a war without a conceivable end point, and living with that knowledge was its own particular discipline. Reggie came out of the plantation's back door and stood beside him. He had found coffee somewhere in the garrison supplies, real coffee, or the imperial equivalent, which turned out to be a dark, bitter preparation that was not quite what either of them meant by the word but that contained sufficient stimulant compounds to perform the function they needed it to perform. He handed Mike a cup. Mike took it without comment. They stood together on the porch and drank the not-quite coffee and watched the mold die and the moss desiccate and the wrong light slowly drain from the plantation's windows, and neither of them spoke for a long time because they had, over the years, developed a precise calibration of when speech was necessary and when the situation required something that speech would only interrupt. Behind them, through the plantation's walls, they could hear Isara and Zoe moving through the structure's rooms. Isara was conducting what Reggie had understood, from her manner and from Zoe's partial translations, to be a kind of assessment, moving through each room with her lightsaber extinguished and both hands available, touching surfaces, reading whatever the Force told her about what the spaces had contained and what remained of it. She was looking, Reggie suspected, for traces. For the residue of the tall man's processes. For anything that might tell her what his presence in the galaxy had done to the Force that could not be undone by his withdrawal. Zoe was cataloging. She had produced another piece of paper from somewhere on her person and was making notes in the systematic way she brought to everything, building a record of the structure's rooms and contents and the state in which she found them. Reggie had asked her once, through gestures and the fragments of shared vocabulary they had developed over the past day and a half, why she was cataloging. She had said something he hadn't fully understood, and he had looked at her face while she said it and understood that the cataloging was not professional habit. It was grief management. It was the thing she did when she had been through something she couldn't yet process. She made a record of it, because making a record was a way of insisting that what had happened, that it was real, that it had a shape and a sequence that could be described, that the chaos had a form even if the form was ugly. He understood this completely. He had a 4-barrel shotgun and a ponytail for the same reason. Sergeant Creech appeared at the corner of the plantation at 0630, picking his way across the transitional ground between Louisiana mud and Mimban marsh grass with the careful tread of a man who had decided some time ago that every surface in the vicinity of the Baker plantation was potentially hostile and was going to continue making that assumption until the evidence definitively contradicted it. He was carrying his own version of the not-quite coffee and a data pad and the expression of a man who had been awake for 36 hours and had used the last 12 of them to write a report that he was genuinely uncertain would not end his career. He stood at the bottom of the porch steps. Looked up at Mike and Reggie. Said something. Reggie looked at him. "We need Zoe," he said. Creech said something else that conveyed, without translation, the quality of a man who had a point he needed to make and was going to make it regardless of the logistical challenges involved. Zoe appeared in the back doorway behind them a minute later, paper in hand, and looked at Creech and looked at Mike and Reggie and said, "He wants to know what you're going to do now." Mike considered the question. It was, in its way, the question that every survivor of a tall man encounter eventually faced, the question of what existence looked like after the immediate crisis, when the structure of survival that the crisis had imposed was suddenly without its structuring crisis, when the machinery of endurance was still running but the thing it had been running in response to had temporarily withdrawn. He had never found a satisfying answer to this question. He had found functional answers, answers that got you through the next day and the day after that, but never a satisfying one. "We need to find a way home," he said, "through Zoe. If there's a way." Creech listened to the translation. Responded. "He says there isn't one," Zoe said. "Not that he knows of. He says dimensional transit isn't, he says it's theoretical. He says the Empire has research into it but it's preliminary and classified at levels he doesn't have access to." "Of course it is," Reggie said. "He says he can transmit a formal request to regional command. He says with the garrison incident report and the physical evidence of the Plantation's presence, there's a case for escalating to someone with the clearance to access the dimensional research program." "How long does that take?" Zoe translated. Creech made a gesture that was universal across every language barrier. "It takes as long as it takes." Isara emerged from the Plantation's back door. She had been inside longer than Zoe, and what she carried out with her was visible not in any physical object but in her expression, which had the quality of someone who has completed a task that needed completing and has arrived at the end of it with an understanding they had not possessed at the beginning. She looked at Creech. Said something that Zoe translated without hesitation, with the directness of someone relaying a statement that required no interpretation. "She's not transmitting anything to regional command. He says with the garrison incident report and the physical evidence of the Plantation's presence, there's a case for escalating to someone with the clearance to access the dimensional research program." "How long does that take?" Zoe translated. Creech made a gesture that was universal across every language barrier. "It takes as long as it takes." Isara emerged from the Plantation's back door. She had been inside longer than Zoe, and what she carried out with her was visible not in any physical object but in her expression, which had the quality of someone who has completed a task that needed completing and has arrived at the end of it with an understanding they had not possessed at the beginning. She looked at Creech. Said something that Zoe translated without hesitation, with the directness of someone relaying a statement that required no interpretation. "She's not transmitting anything to regional command. She's transmitting to the Emperor's office directly." Creech looked at her. His expression underwent several rapid revisions. "She says the Plantation needs to be sealed and guarded until further notice. She says the dimensional research program he mentioned is going to need to be elevated to active priority and cross-referenced with everything the garrison's sensors recorded during the boundary expansion. She says." Zoe paused, checking her translation against something in Isara's tone. "She says this galaxy now has a target on it. She says the tall man found a vergence here and harvested from it, and even though the gateway was destroyed he has the information about what this galaxy contains. He will come back. Not soon, by human reckoning of soon. But he will come back." Mike listened to this translation. Then he looked at Isara and said, "Through Zoe, we know." Isara looked at him. Said something. "She says, is that how you live with it?" Mike thought about this for a moment. He thought about Morningside. About Jody. About 20 years of running and surviving and losing and continuing regardless of losing, about the specific discipline of carrying knowledge you cannot act on and the specific relief of the moments when you can act on it, however briefly, however incompletely. He thought about the fragment and the centuries of the dead compressed into its crystalline structure, and what Isara had said about them, they remember being alive. And the way that phrase had settled somewhere in him and taken up residence with the quality of something that would be present from now on, a new weight in the taxonomy of things he carried. That's how we live with it, he said. We know it's coming. We stop it when we can. We survive the times we can't stop it, so we're present for the next time we can. Zoe translated. Isara listened. Something moved through her expression. Not the disciplined neutrality, not the sharp focus, not the honest admission of limitation. Something older than all of those things, and more personal, and less available to the professional frameworks that usually organized her face. She nodded once. The sun of Mimban was fully above the horizon now, the planet's diffuse atmospheric light distributing itself across the marsh with the impartial gray-gold quality that Reggie had decided was this world's version of morning, the closest it came to the particular quality of light that mornings had in his memory, the light of a new day operating under the premise that new days were worth their difficulty. The transplanted cypress trees cast shadows on the Louisiana mud. The Spanish moss hung motionless in the still air. The plantation's walls were silent. In the marsh, 3 kilometers to the north, the Imperial garrison was beginning its morning routines. Patrols going out. Reports being compiled. The machinery of occupation continuing its function because machinery continued its function, because that was what machinery was designed to do, because the alternative to continuing was stopping and the Empire had not yet found a reason to stop that it considered worth the operational cost. Somewhere in the garrison, a stormtrooper who had been TK 8834 for his entire military career was sitting in the medical bay with his helmet off and his hands in his lap, looking at the wall with the expression of a man reassessing the foundational assumptions of his professional existence. He had been trained for the Empire's enemies. He had a taxonomy of threats, a manual of responses, a hierarchy of command structures that connected every situation he might encounter to an authorized reaction. None of it had prepared him for what he had seen in the past 36 hours. None of it had given him a framework for the plantation, for the spheres, for the converted figures in the brown robes, for the 2 strange men with their chemical propellant weapons and their absolute unconquerable refusal to stop. He was going to need a new taxonomy. He did not yet know where to begin building one. Reggie finished the not-quite coffee. Set the cup on the porch railing. Picked up the 4-barrel from where he had leaned it against the wall and checked the loads with the automatic thoroughness of a habit that required no conscious engagement, the hands performing their check independent of whatever the mind was doing. 3 shells. Same as always. Never enough. Always sufficient. What do we do today? Mike asked. Not rhetorically. Genuinely. The question of a man who had operated within the structure of an immediate crisis for so long that the absence of immediate crisis created a genuine navigational gap. Reggie looked at the plantation. At the dead mold and the desiccating moss and the silent windows. At the alien sky above and the alien sun and the 3 moons that were not visible in daylight but were present nonetheless, as all things were present that you knew were there even when you couldn't see them. He looked at Mike. We find a way home, he said. And while we're finding it, we make sure the thing we stopped stays stopped. And if it doesn't stay stopped, we stop it again, Mike said. We stop it again. They went down the porch steps and across the Louisiana mud and into the transitional ground where 2 geologies met and interpenetrated and forgot they were different things, and then they were on Mimban's native marsh grass, and the plantation was behind them, and the garrison was ahead, and between them and everything that came next was nothing but distance and the specific endurance of 2 men who had learned, through the most comprehensive curriculum available, that continuing was not the same as winning, but that continuing was the thing that made winning eventually possible. The marsh was quiet. In the distance, something silver caught the morning light. And moved. The gateway was gone, but the tall man was not defeated. He was never defeated, only redirected, only delayed, only persuaded by the accumulated resistance of people who refused to stop resisting that this particular location was not worth the cost of remaining. He had what he needed. The knowledge that this galaxy existed, that it contained vergences and force-saturated sites and centuries of accumulated dead waiting to be inventoried, that its defenders were remarkable but finite, that its dimensional architecture was accessible from his own. He would file this galaxy the way he filed everything, in the vast patient archive of places worth returning to, indexed by what they offered and cross-referenced by what they had cost him. Mimban would wait. The vergences would wait. The galaxy far, far away, with its force and its factions and its endless generations of the dead, would wait. The tall man had never yet found a thing that did not eventually stop waiting. Mike and Reggie knew this. They had always known this. They had built their lives on the knowledge, constructed from it not despair but a kind of radical functional acceptance. The acceptance of people who have looked at an unwinnable war and chosen to fight it anyway, not because victory was available but because the alternative to fighting was surrendering something that could not be surrendered and remain anything worth calling a self. In a galaxy far, far away, that choice resonated across frequencies that the Force itself recognized, reverberating through the living web that connected all things, touching the Jedi and the Sith and the ordinary people between them who had never heard of the tall man and never would, leaving in its wake something that was not hope exactly but was the thing that made hope possible. The plantation stood silent on the Mimban marsh. The mold was dead. The morning light held. May the Force be with you. More stories await.